Do you know what it's like to have trouble sleeping? Do you have questions in the night? Do you find yourself awake and the digital clock reads 3:12, then 3:37, then 4:09, and there you are, wide awake? Or do those moments when the doubts and questions find you come at other times of the day? Scripture reminds us that God is light, and in God there is no darkness at all. And I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Our lives depend on that good news, particularly when we can't see where we're going, when the bottom drops out, when prayers go unanswered, and when we feel marooned in the kind of darkness that makes us afraid to move. While this is true, there is also another truth attested to in Scripture, that God meets us in the dark in our questions. While there is no darkness in God, God comes to people in dark clouds, dark nights, dark dreams, dark strangers, in ways that sometimes shock them for good. God does some of God's best work in the dark. Now, none of us asked God that we would be in the darkness. As far as we can tell, no one asked for that in the Bible either, but it happens. God comes to Abram. Later on, God will change his name to Abraham. God comes to Abram where he is there, sitting wondering in the dark. So what's keeping Abram up at night? What are his questions? Genesis 15 begins with God reiterating his promises first made to Abram in chapter 12. Those promises have to do with land and descendants, a name and a blessing. Abram has a dream in which God says to him, "Don't be afraid, for I'm your shield. Your reward will be very great." Now, God doesn't specify the nature of the reward, but Abram connects it to the promise of a son, and so he blurts out the question that's been weighing on him there at night. "What will you give me? For I remain childless." God has been full of promises, but thus far, Abram feels like he's little to show for it. He still has no land and no heir. "What can you give me since I'm childless?" It's not an unbelieving question. We get it. Notably, he does call God sovereign Lord. So he believes God is in charge of his life, but he's struggling to believe that God can do what he's promised. How do we relate to the apparent distance between God's lavish promises and our inability to understand them? In Genesis 15, that's Abram's problem. God has made astounding promises to him, but Abram cannot fathom how the Lord could possibly fulfill those promises. The circumstances may be different, but the same tensions exist in our lives. We're tempted to think that we must close the gap and that we're responsible, that we're on the hook to deliver the performance that makes God's promises a reality. But the story of Genesis 15, and actually all of Scripture, invites us to shift our gaze from what we must do and again focus on what God has done and continues to do. In all his human wisdom, Abram is already looking ahead, and he believes that there's no one there to take his inheritance except his servant Eliezer. God reminds Abram that he will have a son. This Abram, whom God told to leave his home, has been and will, as the story unfolds, be sometimes faithful, sometimes faithless, both bold and cowardly all along the way, just like us. Sometimes God takes what seems like way too long to keep his promises, and it's very tempting to occasionally assume that we have to take matters into our own hands, whether it's financially or relationally or even spiritually.
As Abraham wrestles with the lack of an heir, as he sits with his questions in the dark, God takes Abram outside into a starlit night. Look at the sky, Abram. Count the stars, can you? That's how big your family is going to be. The ruler of the universe, who fashioned the stars without numbers, can and will produce a son for this barren family. God gave him a visual sign, a gift, a way to remember the promise in the middle of the dark night. Now, what exactly did Abraham believe that led God to declare him righteous? Well, Abraham trusted God's promises. No matter how bleak his situation looked on the outside, Abram believed in his heart that God would somehow honor God's promises. The God who makes the promises of countless children to Abram is the God who makes that promise believable to him. The God who later raises Jesus Christ to life is the same God who raises Abram's dying faith to life. All he can do is trust that the Lord will be faithful to his word. And so we read that Abram believed the Lord and God counted it to him as righteousness. Now, what does God do when our faith questions him in the dark? He calls us by faith by repeating his promise. When we struggle to understand God's promises, God invites us to look up and realize that the promises are even more amazing than we thought. And when we wonder how we can know that God will deliver on these promises, he amazes us yet again. The Word graciously credits that faith to Abram as righteousness. To be credited refers to putting money into someone's account. Yet righteousness is more elusive a concept. Citizens of the 21st century might argue being righteous is basically being a nice person. To be righteous in God's sense, though, means to be in right relationship, in conformance of what we think and do and are, to be lined up with God's thinking. To trust the future God has planned enough to quit trying to control our present. It is easy to presume that our present shapes our future. So when the present becomes problematic, we worry about the future. Christian faith sometimes shrinks in the face of loneliness and fear and grief that seems stronger than God. Faith sometimes wilts in the extremes of illness and financial uncertainty that appears to dictate our future. Now comes the pivotal moment in today's word. God is going to take the extra steps and use a language which is foreign to us today, but Abram fully understands to show him what is true. God directs Abram to take a heifer, a goat, and a ram, and cut them in half and lay them on the ground. In the Near East, when agreements between people were still ratified orally, rather than by signing a written document, people would cut animals in half and walk between the carcasses. By doing this, they were announcing that the same fate that befell the sacrificed animals would be the same fate that would come upon them if they failed to keep the agreement. Now look closely at verses 17 and 18. Who walks between those carcasses? Well, it's not Abram, it's God. Abram at this point is just a bystander, and God is the only one in symbolic form of fire and smoke who passes between the pieces. God is not just making a covenant with Abram, God is literally cutting a covenant with him, sealed with the shedding of blood. Most relationships in our time are defined by means of a contract, which we use for all sorts of things. Contracts for renting a house, for buying a house, for buying a car, maintenance contracts, contracts for such and such a service. But contracts are only binding as long as both parties keep the agreement. If one party fails to abide by the agreed upon terms, the contract is void and the person could potentially find themselves in court being sued. That's the way most contracts work. Thankfully, God does not relate to us like that. God does not offer to deal with people by contracts. Instead, God creates covenants. Covenants that are one-sided, unilateral, and unbreakable. A contract is breakable, and you hope that the other party will keep the agreement. A covenant is unbreakable. It's not an if-then proposition. The truth of God making such an unbreakable promise to us is one of the great foundational passages in Scripture. I mean, it's right up there with Genesis 1, the 23rd Psalm, John 3:16, in importance for Christians. Remind yourself of the story again. Who was it that initiated that covenant? God. And who sets the terms of that covenant? God. So this covenant will not ultimately be kept by us, but it has, is, and will continue to be kept by God. Not only is the covenant unilateral, it's also unconditional. God's covenant does not depend on our faithfulness. Hear that a second time. God's covenant does not depend on our faithfulness. If we don't honor the covenant, God does not abandon us and become unfaithful God's self. In this sense, we are like Abram. We're on a journey, just like he was, believing and questioning, trusting and doubting, looking for certainty in the darkness. The only certainty is that our God, who always initiates, who always responds, who always keeps his promises, who is present in the darkness, is the one whose grace is at the heart of the covenant. Now, let's not misunderstand each other. This does not mean that we do not have things that matter, that have consequences. As both Scripture and our life experience bears out, our actions have consequences. Sin hurts other people and hurts us. It hurts our relationships. It alienates us from God and from each other. What we learn here is that God's covenant with Abram reminds us that God will never stop loving us. There is nothing that we can do to make God love us more or love us less. It is out of this foundational love that God invites us to trust God's promises and be active participants in his covenant with all creation. So what's left for us to do? Well, we are invited to trust God's promises, that it is true and that it's for us, and that our faith might be reckoned to us as righteousness, just as Abram's was. Now, faith, by definition, requires making a leap, actually making several leaps over the course of our lives. The decision to live a life in covenant with God means that we choose to live counterintuitively, not solely based on what logic might tell us. For instance, in this story, logic, common sense, told Abram that he and Sarai were not going to have any children. But God's promise and covenant said something else. Common sense told Abram that he was a desert herdsman, not the father of a great nation. But God's promise said something else. Common sense said that the divine God of the universe couldn't be held accountable to an unconditional guarantee to human beings. But once again, God's promise said something else. Our common sense will tell us all kinds of rational things. But who and what will we believe when God's promises say something else? Once we have made a leap of faith, the next thing we need to do is to seek to keep the covenant with God. We do that by the way we live our lives, knowing that we won't be able to maintain it by our own effort. A covenant-keeping life requires living out every aspect of our lives in tune with the world around us, particularly with those who are the most vulnerable in our world. We do this by taking seriously Jesus' two great commands and having them be our defining compass. And what is that? You've forgotten? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and all your mind. And the second one is just as important. And love your neighbor, all of your neighbors, as you love yourself.
Parts of our passage are so bizarre that we might be tempted to feel like we can't relate to them at all. You and I have never cut up animals and arranged their bloody body parts in a row, for example. But for all of its strangeness, this is a story many of us can relate to very easily, because we know what it's like to begin a walk with God as Abram did. We've heard God's call to believe his promises, and we leave our life in a sinful world behind. We walk with him as pilgrims in a foreign land. Some of the times it's easy, but not always. And then comes those periods of darkness. It's a challenge after years of walking by faith in the promises of God. It feels to you that some of them haven't come true. You haven't seen the same kind of results from a life of faith that you counted on. And you begin to struggle with your faith. You question God in the darkness. What can even God do in this impossible situation? How can I be sure that God is going to do what he's promised? This isn't actually unusual. Faith can and does wax and wane for all of us. We can trust God in one area of life and struggle in another. Indeed, sometimes moments of great faith are followed by times of doubt. In the darkness, God is saying, I have a plan for your future. And that road stretches out before you into the darkness, and it's all laid out by me. The darkness is ruled not by the forces of evil or chaos or chance, but by the creator of the world, the sovereign Lord. He keeps his promises to those who walk with him in faith. How can we be sure that God will keep his promises in this darkness in which we might now find ourselves? What do we do to verify this truth? Well, God swears to keep his promises on pain of death. In Genesis 15, God initiates and ratifies a covenant with Abram. That's what we're talking about this morning. Later in the New Testament, God will initiate and ratify through Jesus Christ a new covenant. Like the old covenant, Jesus takes the initiative and seals the new covenant by the shedding of his blood. It's true that no one wants to be sitting in the darkness asking questions. But we, from the stories of Scripture, come to understand that there are real benefits to this kind of faith experience. It's a time to use senses you don't use when your eyes are working perfectly fine. There's time to wonder where you think you're going and why. There's even time for the feelings you usually outrun to catch up with you. Another unforeseen benefit is that none of your outside normal navigational tools that you use when things are going well are helpful now. And while that's true, what you do have is the sacred whispers of God that you can learn to trust when you're walking by faith and not by sight. Now, none of these benefits of these situations may seem like a good place to be, but if you are in that place, if you are already in the dark, if you're already thinking you must have done something wrong, or that God has abandoned you, or that maybe you've lost your way and you're never going to find it again, this passage is good news. It's the best news. All of the benefits of the darkness don't seem like benefits, and we want to say, no, thank you. But when you're already in the middle of those dark nights, it can be a wholly transformational thing at 3:12, at 3:50, when your doubts and questions catch up with you. And why might that be an absolute truth? Because the same promise and the same presence that was there for Abram and Sarai thousands of years ago are just as clearly here for you and I right now today. So as you sit and you wait and you wonder, listen as God repeats those promises to you. And maybe even look out your window at the stars as a reminder instead of looking at that alarm clock. Jesus died so that we could know for sure that the Lord Almighty will keep his promises no matter how dark it may get in our lives. Heaven and earth may pass away, but the word of the Lord stands forever. We are people of the covenant. You can stake your life on it. God did, and he does. And to God be the glory.
And to God be the glory.
Amen.
Amen.